This last duty thus constitutes the perfect divine law, or the positive ethical action towards the individual. Every other relationship to him which does not remain one simply of love but is ethical belongs to human law and has the negative significance of raising the individual above his confinement within the natural community to which he in his natural existence belongs. Now, although human right has for its content and power the actual ethical substance that is conscious of itself, that is, the entire nation, while the divine right and law has for its content and power the individual who is beyond the real world, yet he is not without power. His power is the abstract, pure universal, the elemental individual which equally draws back into the pure abstraction, which is its essence, the individuality that breaks loose from the element and constitutes the self-conscious reality of the nation, draws it back into the essence which is its ground. How this power is manifested in the notion itself, we shall see in the ensuing development. In paragraph 453, Hegel is going to specify a bit more about what he is calling this last duty, this letzte Pflicht towards the dead individual who is a member of the family, on the part of the blood relative. So he tells us two things that are very interesting here, the ways in which he characterizes this last duty. He says, this constitutes the perfect divine law, and it's the positive ethical action, Handlung in German, towards the individual. And let's talk about the second one first. We'll come back to the first one in a bit. He says, every other relationship to him, to the person who has died, which does not remain one simply of love, that is, love in terms of affection, right, or natural desire, but is ethical, belongs to human law, and has the negative significance of raising the individual above his confinement within the natural community to which he in his natural existence belongs. So Hegel is not denying one bit that within the community, the nation, the people, whatever you want to conceive of it, the culture, there are going to be a lot of norms surrounding what our comportment ought to be towards the dead. For example, if you look at any particular modern state, you're going to find a whole set of arrangements, often down at the local level here in our United States, pertaining to burial customs and rites and what's allowable and what's not, and what has to be done with the bodies of the dead. There may be money set aside for burying or otherwise disposing of those who nobody comes to claim. So that is a way of treating the individual as an individual. And then we have all the other things that go along with it, inheritance, all of that is over here. And then we have love over here, which Hegel says, that's nice if you've got it, but that's not yet an ethical relation. So what is the ethical relation that is this last duty? It's something beyond that. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. So now Hegel sketches out a sort of dichotomy, a splitting, a contrast, which is going to eventually become a full-on conflict between human law and right. He uses the terms Recht here, as well as Gesetz, and divine law. And here we have an interesting transformation. Notice what Hegel doesn't talk about. He doesn't talk about the gods. He doesn't talk about divine law as something that comes down from on high through some sort of revelation. Instead, it's something else that is, you might say, rising up from below within the matrix of the family and the blood relation. What is the divine here? That's the question we want to ask. So he says, although human law, or human right rather, has for its content and power the actual ethical substance that is conscious of itself, that is, the entire nation, the entire community, While the divine right and law has for its content and power, notice what he says, the individual beyond the real world. So what do we have here? We have a contrast between not just, you might say, the public and the private, but between the universal in the sense of everybody and the universal in the sense of me, the individual. We also have a contrast here in terms of what is manifest versus what is hidden. But even more so, an apparent contrast, as Hegel is going to tell us, between what is powerful and what has no power. Why do the dead have no power? Because as the dead, they no longer belong to the real world. They are no longer wirklich. They are no longer doing things out there in public. Unless we're going to, have something like a Weekend at Bernie's sort of example, which, has been done politically in some cases. But in that case, it's the living using the dead as a prop. It's not the dead, him or herself. Hegel says they're not powerless. His power is the abstract, pure universal, the elemental individual, which equally draws back into the pure abstraction, which is its essence, the individuality that breaks loose from that element and constitutes the self-conscious reality of that nation, draws it back into the essence, which is its ground. Now, when you read that, you might say, what kind of power is that? That doesn't sound like power to do anything. That just sounds like a bunch of abstractions about abstraction. Well, there is a power there. It is the power of being something different that disrupts, that doesn't fit in, that subverts this, bright, open system where everybody's relating to each other in, we might say, the world above. How is that going to play itself out? Hegel says we're not quite there yet. How this power is manifested in the notion itself, we shall see in the ensuing development. So he is just putting this idea out there. He's not saying, I'm defining how this power works at this point, but he is prepping us for it. Now notice, again, I want to stress this. Perfect divine law, but a divine law which at this point in time is not the gods telling us what to do, but something else going on. How does this divine law play itself out? Why does it have to do with the family and this last duty? These are the questions that we're now going to explore. Now, in the one law, as in the other, there are also differences and gradations. For since both laws have within them the moment of consciousness, difference is developed within the laws themselves, and this constitutes their movement and their own peculiar life. Consideration of these differences reveals the way in which they operate and the mode of self-consciousness of the two universal essential natures of the ethical world, and also their connection and transition into one another. Here in this very short paragraph, number 454, Hegel is still setting the scene, and now he's bringing us almost right up to the very edge of analyses of the human and divine law. And he's suggesting to us that first we need to examine each of these in its own development, and then we can look at how they come into competition or conflict with each other and what ensues from that. So he tells us that in the one law, as in the other, there are differences and gradations. So neither of these laws is something perfectly simple. Really makes sense in terms of human law. If you think about how complex the norms governing any particular society are, we're often tempted when we're doing, historical presentation or reconstruction to oversimplify and say about, particular peoples that there's a principle around which their entire life is organized. It never really turns out to be quite like that. Or if there is something that's identifiable as a principle from a Hegelian perspective, that always sort of unfolds itself and shows us that there's a whole bunch of different principles at play, and that they're involved with each other, and oftentimes in antithesis with each other, and that has to be worked out. So there are going to be gradations, higher and lower. There is going to be what Hegel's calling movement differences being developed within each of these, and that's important to keep in mind. Remember that in this discussion of spirit, we're getting closer and closer to the concrete. We're still engaged in a process that's a bit removed from it, as carrying out phenomenological analyses. And we are engaged in some very high, looking at it from above, sort of generalizing, but we do want to try to be as concrete as possible, however difficult that may be. So he says, why is it that there are differences and gradations? Both laws have within themselves the moment of consciousness. So what does this involve? There is difference developed within the laws themselves, and this difference, he says, constitutes their movement and their life. Each of these is a living law. So the differences that are coming about by the mere fact that these are laws for conscious beings, laws of conscious beings, laws by conscious beings, means that there's going to be some splitting going on, some differentiation, and some movement within them. So he says, if we consider these differences, we're going to understand the ways in which they operate. That's what we really want to understand. We don't want to assume, for example, that human law and divine law are really the same thing, since we've got law in the first place, and divine law is just sort of a projection of human law. That would be a mistake, Hegel thinks. We also don't want to go the other way and say, we just take the divine law, and human law is all based on that. Hegel is really trying to take account of the fact that we are dealing with two complex things, two complex manifestations of spirit, of Geist, of mind in history that we don't want to lose sight of by substituting our own Vorstellungen, our own representations, our own picture thinking for them. And this is a vice of many social theories, of trying to be oversimplistic about this, or dismissing one side and only focusing on the other side. So Hegel says that if we consider these differences, we'll see the way in which they operate and the mode of self-consciousness of the two universal essential natures of the ethical world. Why did Hegel pick these two? He does think these are the two universal essential natures of the ethical world, at least at this point in development of spirit, of the development of human consciousness. So he goes on and he says, we'll also get to see their connection and transposition into one another. So, like I just began by saying, first we want to examine how these two laws do develop, and then we're going to look at how they connect up with each other and where the areas in which they come into conflict are and how those conflicts get worked through. The community, the superior law whose validity is openly apparent, has its real vitality in the government as that in which it has an individual form. Government is the reality of spirit that is reflected into itself, the simple self of the entire ethical substance. This simple power does indeed allow the family to expand into its constituent members and to give to each part an enduring being and a being for self of its own. Spirit has in this its reality or its objective existence, and the family is the element of this reality. But spirit is at the same time the power of the whole, which brings these parts together again into a negative unity, giving them the feeling of their lack of independence, and keeping them aware that they have their life only in the whole. The community may, on the one hand, organize itself into systems of personal independence and property, of laws relating to persons and things, and on the other hand, the various ways of working for ends which are, in the first instance, particular ends, those of gain and employment. It may articulate into their own special and independent associations. The spirit of universal assembly and association is the simple and negative essence of those systems which tend to isolate themselves. In order not to let them become rooted and set in this isolation, thereby breaking up the whole and letting the communal spirit evaporate, government has from time to time to shake them to their core by war. By this means, the government upsets their established order and violates their right to independence, while the individuals who, absorbed in their own way of life, break loose from the whole and strive after the inviolable independence and security of the person, are made to feel in the task laid on them their lord and master, death. Spirit, by thus throwing into the melting pot the stable existence of these systems, checks their tendency to fall away from the ethical order and to be submerged in a merely natural existence, and it preserves and raises conscious self into freedom and its own power. The negative essence shows itself to be the real power of the community and the force of its self-preservation. The community therefore possesses the truth and the confirmation of its power in the essence of the divine law and in the realm of the netherworld. Here in this longer paragraph, 455, Hegel is beginning to sketch out for us just how the human law works. And you notice that by the very end of this, it's going to, whether it likes it or not, end up bringing in the divine law as almost like it's an inescapable shadow. But first, what Hegel is going to do is sketch out for us a very, oversimplified version. This isn't, his finished view on this, but what we need at this point in time about how the human law works for the ethical community in terms of its constituent parts and what we might call its driving or dominating part. Then he's going to talk about one of the key functions that keeps what we could call ethical motifs and motivations in play against a counter tendency for those to gradually settle out and be replaced by other intentions and processes. So he uses this term community, or what Miller's translating as community here, Gemeinwesen, literally the essence of what is in common, right? And he's using this instead of using the other terms that he has been employing, like folk, the nation is how that's usually translated, or the people, and Staat, just translated by its cognate state. And here he's talking about something that would encompass those, but does, of course, include elements of the state and does include elements of the folk. And he's placing all of these into relation with each other. So he says the community, and he calls this the superior law whose validity is openly apparent, right? The human law, which is above board, as we've said, manifest to all. And then he says it has its vitality in the government. This is a term that he's already used, the Regierung, the rulership, the sovereign authority, whatever we want to call it, the magistracy, the people who make sure that things get done, right? The coordinators. So he says that they have their real vitality in the government as that in which it has an individual form. The government is where this is consolidated and given agency. It says government is the reality of spirit that is reflected into itself, the simple self of the entire ethical substance. So in the way in which it understands itself and its own activities and its relations to other elements or portions or dimensions of the community, this is how spirit, through the human law, gets to know itself and continually understands itself and expands itself and contracts itself in certain ways and reinterprets itself. So, I mean, the government can, of course, change hands, but this governmental function is going to be central in the entire way in which the human law plays itself out. So he goes on and he says, this simple power does indeed allow the family to expand into its constituent members. So in addition to a government, within a state we have the family, and indeed, as I put here, plural families, right? And within each of these families, there is a certain scope of independence and freedom within that framework. So unless the state is getting very nosy and delving into certain families, which, at a certain point it probably has to do, particularly in modern states, the family is a place where these relations can develop, which allows these individuals, the members of the family, to be developed within that scope. And so what we have here is an interplay between the government and the families that are allowed their own scope. And the government is over the families. The government may, in fact, be run by a family, and then things get very, very messy, right? But the family does get to expand into its constituent members and to give to each part an enduring being and being for self of its own. We saw this, for example, just in the past paragraphs in terms of funerary rites, right? So he goes on and he says, spirit has in this its reality or its objective existence. And the family is an element of this reality. So the family is an element of the working of the human law, within the law of the community. The government is superior to the family within this, because the government embodies spirit in the sense of the human law, knowing itself, unfolding itself, applying itself to the activities of families. Doesn't mean that it takes over the family entirely. As a matter of fact, you get the idea that Hegel thinks that would, not just here in this place, but also in his other writings, that would be a terrible idea. The family actually has a function. We don't want to simply replace it with some surrogate of the state or the government. So he goes on and he says, spirit is at the same time the power of the whole, which brings these parts together into a negative unity, giving them the feeling of their lack of independence, keeping them aware that they have their life only in the whole. Now, he doesn't spell this out, but this is worth reflecting on. This feeling of not being totally independent, of being part of the whole, it's easy to see how that would fit in with the family, because the family can walk outside and realize that they live on a street in a city which is run by other people not in that family, right? You exit the house and you're now within the larger community. What about the government? Is the government aware of a similar, although not on the exact same grounds, lack of independence? Yes and no. When governments think that they are the totality of the community, that's usually a sign that things have gone off the rails, isn't it? And things are going to get very bad. When the government is aware of its own limited nature, then there's a sort of internal contradiction going on. On the one hand, they are spirit reflected into itself. They are the ones who speak for the community. On the other hand, they have to be aware that they are not the totality of the community, that there are other things, other rational beings that can present themselves against the government. Hegel then talks about something else, something that allows what he calls special and independent associations. This we might think of as the economic life and the civil society life within the community, something that is not just of the families, where people are related to each other through reproduction, blood ties, all of those sorts of associations, and not just a matter of government and its many different, tentacles reaching into other things, but how individuals and families and perhaps even governmental agencies associate with each other into purposed organization that is different than that of government and different than that merely of the family. So he says the community may, on the one hand, organize itself into systems of personal independence and property. Now that does involve the family, right? And that does also involve the government or the state, if you like. Because as Hegel is going to point out, this involves laws relating to persons and things. But that's not all that's going on there. This tends to take on a sort of life of its own. We see this even more in the second motif that he brings up. On the other hand, the various ways of working for ends, which are in the first instance particular ends, those of gain and enjoyment, it may articulate into their own special and independent associations. What does this mean? These are workplaces. These are companies. These are places where buying and selling goes on. These are ways in which transactions take place. And notice that the systems of persons and property and the ways of working towards ends, these interfuse with each other. So on the one hand, we could say, well, look, this is primarily a matter of the government and has to do with this. This is coming the other way, and this is what nourishes and allows there to be a political economy in the first place that then the government might have some insight into, right? And there's more to it than just, say, political economy. This is the entire class of what Locke called voluntary associations, what de Tocqueville in his time called intermediate associations. This could be your bridge club. This could be a brewing association of people who are interested not just in making a buck, but in making good beer. This could be a chess club. This could be all sorts of other things. This could be a foundation that's established for helping out those whose families are in terrible situations, where the charity of the government is unable to see or even to effectively reach. All of this is part of the community. All of this is the totality of the community. Now notice what Hegel says next. Here we take a little bit of an interesting turn. So he says, the spirit of universal assembly and association is the simple and negative essence of those systems which tend to isolate themselves. All of this stuff over here tends to isolate itself. Hegel says that one of the roles of government is shaking stuff up, keeping these from declining out of the realm of the ethical into the non-ethical. Now, how does it do that? War. War is how it does it. Conflict. He says, in order to not let them become rooted and set in their isolation, thereby breaking up the whole and letting the communal spirit evaporate, government has from time to time to shake them to their core by war. Where have we seen this shaking to the core before? In the master-slave dialectic. Well, actually, just before it, and then right after it, is in the master-slave dialectic, right? The two consciousnesses confront each other. One is shaken to its core, gives in. That becomes the slave. Both of them are willing to brave death. Now it's no longer the master becoming the one who braved death more and thereby subjugates the slave. No, the government is the one that sets everyone into war or puts the nation at risk or however you want to think about it. So it's more complicated. Don't read master-slave dialectic into this. rather read what this shaken to the core could be into that. He says, by this means the government upsets their established order, violates their right to independence. Why? Because the government asserts, look, the community matters more than trade associations or, even the systems of law and property, which may need to be set aside for the time being. You could think, for example, of, wartime impositions, like abolishing habeas corpus here in the United States, things that happened during the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and on into the War on Terror, right? So he says, the individuals who, absorbed in their own way of life, break loose from the whole and strive after the inviolable independence and security of the person, are made to feel, in the task laid on them, their Lord and Master. And again, hearkening back to the self-consciousness section, who is the ultimate master? Death. Now here is where the government, acting on behalf of the community or the superior law, the human law, has bitten off more than it can successfully chew, let alone digest. Now it's going to bring in the divine law, whether it likes it or not. He says, spirit, by throwing into the melting pot the stable existence of these systems, checks their tendency to fall away from the ethical order and to be submerged in a merely natural existence. And it preserves and it raises conscious self into freedom and its own real power. However, there's something else going on. The negative essence shows itself to be the real power of the community. What is the real power of the community? The fact that it can compel, right? The force of its self-preservation. The community, he says, therefore possesses the truth and the confirmation of its power in the essence, not of the human law, but of the divine law, and in the realm of the netherworld. What is the netherworld? We're going to explore that a little bit here in a bit. The netherworld is not a second world underneath this world. It's the world that you can't see. Aedes. Hades is how we translate it in English. Aedes, that which is not seen, the invisible world. Now, we have a lot more yet to sketch out, but you've seen two important movements. Hegel sketching out how things are developing, and then this need to make sure that these do not fall away from the ethical. The government making this movement of throwing them into some sort of crisis or battle or war, and then that reintroducing for the potentially no longer ethical individuals something else on the scene, something that can connect them to the community, and yet on the other end places them in relation to death.